Part 2.75, Kenan, which is page 155 to 176. The brewery has been badly damaged and parts of it are no longer safe, but its springs are deep beneath the surface, and the basement of the buildings is impenetrable even to the men on the hills, though that hasn't stopped them from trying to level the bright red building. The brewery is situated in a vulnerable position, only a short distance from the occupied hills. There have been several mortar attacks here already. So far, none of them has happened on days when Kenan was present. Outside, there are about 100 people in line for water. Kenan has been here when the line had as many as 300 people, and he's happy that he won't have to wait for hours today. Water hoses coming out to the street from the brewery feed large pipes set up off the ground on supports, which in turn have smaller hoses branching off of them. Kenan estimates that 20 people at a time can get water, and most have roughly as many canisters as he does, so it shouldn't be too long before it's his turn. People move forward at a steady pace, though it seems that just as one person leaves with their water, another enters the line. There's a man at the front of the line who has a dog with him. It's a medium-sized dog, some sort of terrier with curly brownish fur. There's a thermos tied to its collar, but before the man fills up his bottle, he takes the lid off the thermos and fills it. He places it on the ground, and as he fills his 4 large canisters, the dog laps up the water in the thermos lid as though it was a race, which Kenan supposes it is. When the man has finished filling his canisters, he fills the terrier's thermos and puts on the lid. Not a drop is left in it. He ties the thermos to the dog's collar and begins to load his canisters into a makeshift dolly he's using to transport them. Kenan has considered using a dolly, but decided that there was too much debris in the street that might clog its wheels and make it difficult to maneuver, slowing him down. Now, though, seeing how much water the man is able to transport, he wonders whether he might try one on his next trip. If he could fill his 2 backup containers, and maybe find a couple more somewhere, he wouldn't have to make the trip as often. At the taps, people try to move as quickly as they can. No one wants to linger, but it's a rare opportunity to be out and among others, so some of them can't help themselves from taking perhaps a bit longer than they need. He hears the sound of water and people in the engines of large trucks that haul water to who knows where, maybe to the troops on the front. If he forgets why he's there, he can almost imagine everything is normal, that this is an everyday street scene. He tries to let his eyes go a little out of focus, tries to believe he's at an outdoor market. People are talking about a concert or a football match. It's a good feeling, but it lasts only for an instant, because a woman is shouting at him to take his place at a vacated tap. After a muttered apology, he steps forward. The water pours from the pipes, slapping onto the pavement at his feet. Kenan has never understood why they don't have a valve at each outlet to shut off the water between users. It seems to him an awful waste of such a precious resource. He's risked his life for this water he can't get anywhere else, and here it is running into the ground as though it doesn't matter. Perhaps they can't get the necessary plumbing, or perhaps it has something to do with the pumps, or perhaps the supply of water underneath the brewery is so vast that it's more trouble than it's worth. He hopes someone has done their homework, that they're absolutely certain the water will keep running. He leans down until his containers are on the ground, steps out of the rope that runs over each shoulder and across the back of his neck. He kneels. He places Mrs. Rostovsky's containers in front of him and unties his own. With a sharp twist, he removes the caps and places them in a neat pile. His bottles are lined up on his left, 2 rows of 4. He flexes his hands, takes a deep breath, moves his shoulder in a circle 3 times until he feels his muscles loosen. Then he picks up the first bottle and places its neck under the stream of cold water. When it's full, he places it to his right, and as quickly as he can, he reaches left and grabs another container, gets it under the flow of water in one smooth movement designed to keep as much water from spilling out onto the street as possible. He couldn't say why he does this. He just doesn't want to be responsible for waste. To him, water has come to mean life, and if more of it is lost, he doesn't want to be a part of it. He fills the second container with a practiced efficiency, and then the 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th. Kenan has heard it said that you never hear the shell that kills you. He doesn't know if this is true, has no idea how anyone can know or even pretend to know. But when he hears the telltale whistle of an incoming shell, however, he knows that he has never heard this sound so close before. The shell is going to fall very near to him, and he can't accurately gauge where it's going to land, because he has no experience in determining how this sound corresponds to proximity. In a split second, before the shell hits, he thinks of a time when he was a boy and got into a fight in the schoolyard. He wasn't much of a fighter, had never been in a fight before, and what he remembers is seeing the other boy's fist, seeing it coming at him slow like a yawn, and thinking to himself, I'm about to get punched in the face. Now, though, he sees that fist coming to him and thinks, I'm about to die. The shell hits, and an instant after hearing the loudest sound he thought the world could contain, Kenan is knocked off his feet. The boy who punched him 30 years ago has grown into a prize fighter and punched him again. He sprawls on his back and stays down, dazed. His ears are ringing, and he doesn't hear the whistle of the second incoming shell, but he hears its detonation. It echoes through his head for what feels like years, and then for a few seconds there's total silence. He wonders if he's gone deaf. His back is wet and he assumes he's wounded, but as his hearing returns, he hears screaming all around him and thinks that if he were wounded, he would feel something. Kenan finds he can't move. He wants to, but his limbs don't respond. Perhaps he's dead. He can see people running by him down the street to the right, and he doesn't know why they're not stopping. Then he finds he can move his foot and then his leg and then his other leg and his arms, and he's restored to the land of the living. He sits up, feels himself for wounds, finds he's fine. He's sitting on a pool of water, though his bottles aren't tipped over. He isn't sure whether he should feel relieved or ashamed. The shells hit about 30 meters up the street from him, near the end of the line. He stands and begins to walk towards where they landed. There are already people there, rushing, frantic, trying to save those who could be saved. On the pavement in front of him is a foot. The shoe is undamaged, as is some of the sock. It doesn't look real. Then he sees a woman holding her leg, stunned, as if she doesn't believe it either. She looks at Kenan and begins to shriek, points at her leg to where her foot used to be. Two men rush towards her, one of them tying a piece of fabric around her leg at the thigh, and she passes out. The men pick her up and work their way up the street. There's a car waiting there, and they put her in the back beside a man who has blood running down his face from a 15-centimeter gash in his head. His ear is attached to his head only at the lobe, but he doesn't seem to notice. The men close the door on the woman and move to the other side of the car to take a look at him. They confer and remove him from the car, placing him at the side of the road. He doesn't move, though his eyes are open, and Kenan realizes the man is dead. Another group arrives with two more injured people, a man bleeding from his stomach and a child maybe 10 years old who's unconscious. They're hastily placed in the car, the man at the back and the child in the front. They remind Kenan of a family. In all likelihood, they've never met before. He wonders what his own family is doing right now, is thankful that he hasn't brought any of his children with him, though they've asked time and time again, and he's glad for their company and the help carrying the water home. He can't risk one of them going home with another family. One of the men bangs his hand on the rear window of the car and it speeds off. Kenan turns around, and in front of him is the man with the brown terrier. He's still holding the leash, or half of it. It's been severed, and the man's leg is bleeding. He looks at the space at the end of the leash where the dog should be, but then at the street around him. Have you seen my dog? He asks Kenan. No, Kenan answers. You're bleeding, sir. The man doesn't seem to hear him. Friend, have you seen my dog? Kenan puts his hand on the man's arm. You're hurt. You need help. The man ignores him, brushes off his hand. He limps away, stops the woman after a few steps, and repeats his question. There are sirens in the distance coming from the other side of the river, and when he hears the sound of shelling, followed by the sharp crack of sniper fire, they're firing at the ambulances sent to help. And as the sirens get closer, he begins to worry that they're drawing the fire towards him, towards the brewery. But the men on the hills can hit the brewery any time they like. They're firing at the ambulances to tell him and everyone else that help will not arrive if they have anything to say about it. Someone somewhere turns on the air raid sirens, and the sound of ambulances is drowned out. On the top of the street, a car slides to a halt, and a few more people are deposited inside. A line of bodies on the side of the road has grown. All around him, people are screaming, running, shouting, moaning. Those who are injured but can walk are making their way to the top of the street in the hope that it won't be long before a car can take them. Kenan thinks they can hear the shelling as well as he can, so they must know their ordeal isn't over. Those who can't walk are being carried. The first of the ambulances arrives and unloads a half-dozen stretchers into waiting arms. The sound of air raid sirens swells and then dies off, swells again. After a while, it begins to sound to him like the breathing of an asthmatic. Kenan is able to identify three types of people here. There are those who ran away as soon as the shells fell, their instinct for self-preservation stronger than their sense of altruism or civic duty. Then there are those who didn't run, who are now covered in the blood of the wounded, and they work with a myopic urgency to help those who can be saved, to remove those who can't, to go to whatever awaits them next. Then there's the third type, the group Kenan falls into. They stand, mouths gaping, and watch as others run or help. He's surprised he didn't run, isn't a part of the first group, and he wishes he were a part of the second. He looks down at his feet. He's only a few meters from where the first shell struck. There aren't many people left here now, no more than a dozen. In places, the ground is stained dark red, but where he stands, it's clean. Water runs down from the taps, which are undamaged, and there's a clear river in the center of the road. The gutter is turning pink, washing away the blood spilled only minutes ago. Kenan walks back up the hill to his canisters. His 6 are full. He binds them together, 3 on each side. He looks at the water rushing out of the pipe in front of him. It won't be long before the street is clear again. He reaches out and puts his hand over the tap. It's easy to block and the water stops, but all around him other pipes continue to flow. He's soaked to the skin and he knows that he can stand here with his hands on the pipe for a year and it will make no difference. He steps back, watches the water run downhill away from him. He imagines it traveling through the streets and ending up in the Miljaka, from there making its way out of Sarajevo until it runs into the ocean. And this is how it goes. Buildings are eviscerated, burned, gutted, streetcars destroyed, roads and bridges blasted away, and you can see that, you can touch it, and you can walk by it every day. But when people die, they're removed, taken to hospitals and graveyards, and before the bodies are healed or cold, the spot where they were shattered is unrecognizable as a place where anything out of the ordinary happened. This is why the men on the hills are able to kill with impunity. If there were always bodies in the streets rotting where they fell, if the water from these taps didn't wash away the blood, bone, and skin, then maybe the men would be forced to stop. Maybe they would want to stop. At the top of the street, an old Yugo hatchback takes away the last of the wounded. At the side of the road, there are at least 7 bodies. A large blue van pulls up. 4 men get out and begin to put the corpses into the back, 1 man on each arm and 1 man on each leg. The bodies are loaded in feet first, and as they're lifted into the van, their heads loll back as if taking one last look at the place where they died. Kenan picks up one of Mrs. Rostovsky's bottles. He pays no attention to the water that is spilled as his grip falters and the bottle tilts. When it's full, he doesn't rush. He takes his time as he caps the first bottle, then fills the second. He sets the bottles on the ground and stands there. He's grown used to the sound of air raid sirens, hasn't noticed it for a while. Now he hears them again and he listens to them wail, listens to the screech of shells falling, the gunfire from both sides. He puts his hand under the water, washes them even though they're not dirty, leans down, and puts the rope over his head. He picks up Mrs. Rostovsky's water, 1 bottle in each hand, and stands. The rope cuts into his neck and shoulders, and he bends down, shifting it to a more comfortable position. Then he stands once more and turns away from the men who are loading the last of the bodies into the van. He begins to walk down the hill, past the spot where the first motor fell, then the spot where the second fell. He doesn't stop, doesn't look at the ground. There's nothing more to see. At the bottom of the street, Kenan stops. He isn't sure of his route. He can head to the east, cross at the library using the same bridge he came over on, or he can go straight downhill and take the one of the 2 bridges that will be in his path. Both these routes are being shelled at the moment, and he's weighed down by the water, making it hard to run. He decides he has only 2 viable choices. He can find shelter and wait out the shelling, which could take hours, or he can cross at the Kermirja bridge, what little is left of it. Neither choice is appealing. The thought of waiting hours, possibly overnight, before crossing the Miljaka is too much, so he decides to cross at the Kermirja. It will mean carrying his load across bare steel girders, risking falling into the river. He'll have to make at least 2, perhaps 3 trips to get all his water across. But it will be worth it to be home again out of all of this madness, wrapped back up in the temporary illusion of safety. Kenan turns to his left, heads west. When he reaches the street leading north to one more direct bridges, he looks down to the river and sees a car burning just before the deck of the bridge. It's the same model and color as the Yugo he saw at the brewery. He hopes it isn't the same one. He takes a long breath, then another, and looks across the street. He picks out a reasonably sheltered doorway and tightens his grip on Mrs. Rostovsky's bottles. He moves as fast as he can towards the doorway. When he's halfway across the street, it occurs to him that he's waddling like a penguin, and imagines what he must look like to anyone watching him. He remembers that the only person he needs to worry about watching him is the one who's looking through a scope. Appearing like a penguin is the least of his worries. But then he wonders whether waddling like a fat, flightless bird makes him more or less likely to get shot. Do the men on the hills tend to shoot at people they find funny or spare them? If he dressed in a penguin suit, would he survive this war? He reaches the doorway and stops for a rest. He's made it across without getting shot, but he'll never know whether it was because someone chose not to shoot him or if no one saw him at all. This bothers him, this lack of information. And he realizes to his disgust that while he was crossing the street, while his life was in a gray space, he was making jokes to himself about penguins. There's no way that his friend Ismet sits in a hole in the front lawn and thinks such silly, meaningless thoughts. It's things like this that will make him the coward he is, unable to help the wounded at a massacre, or a relatively unharmed man searching for his dog. He didn't help the man look, or look himself, or even think about looking. He remembers the dog, a brown terrier, and he would know if he saw it again. Perhaps it's still there. He should go back for it. It could be waiting in a doorway or behind a pile of rubble, waiting for someone to find it. But Kenan doesn't put his water down. He doesn't go back to look for the dog. He has no doubt that the dog is dead, has always known it, and he knows that even if it wasn't, he wouldn't go back. Fear has paralyzed him as surely as a bullet to the spine, and he simply doesn't have what it takes to go back. Shame soaks through him. All he wants now is to go home and crawl into bed. He leaves the doorway, continues westward. On his left is the abandoned army barracks, shelled to the ground by its former tenants. On his right is At Mejyan, where slaves were sold, men were executed, and later horses raced. It's now a park, or it would be if there was still such a thing as a park in the city. Before the war, he'd come here often with his family to hear outdoor concerts, and sometimes he'd sit by himself on a bench and drink a coffee on a warm fall day. He moves as quickly as he can, stopping every so often to catch his breath, but he doesn't linger any longer than he has to. He tries to keep his mind blank, to stop any thoughts that could render him motionless from prying their way into his mind. As he doglegs to the north, a group of bright and yellow apartments come into view, nicknamed the Parrots by those in the city that thought they were an eyesore. Kenan himself never had a firm opinion about them, though he knew he wouldn't want to live there. Now, though, he's happy to see them, because they stand at the foot of the Kamurya Bridge. There's a man on the other side who has just begun crossing, and though it might be possible for two people to cross at once, if one of them stood aside in the middle and let the other pass, Kenan isn't sure whether he could balance the water canisters, and he doesn't know whether this man would give him the right of way, so he decides to wait. He can't carry all the water over at once. Maybe he could if Mrs. Rostovsky's bottles had handles, and he could tie them in with his own bottles, but the way things are, it's impossible. He decides he can take all of his own bottles in one go, though. They're heavy but balanced, and if he takes 3 at a time, there is no way to balance them. He'll leave Mrs. Rostovsky's bottles by some rocks and go back for them. Without his own bottles, he'd be able to tuck one under his arm and hold the other in his hand, leaving one hand free to hold on to the side rail of the bridge. He thinks about his plan. He decides it's a good one, but is worried someone will take Mrs. Rostovsky's containers while he's crossing the bridge. He waits for the man on the bridge to finish crossing, nods a hello to him as he passes, and then moves Mrs. Rostovsky's bottles to a concealed spot, a small hole where the bridge meets the road. Satisfied that the bottles are safely out of sight, he shoulders his load of water and steps onto the bridge. After a few steps, he has to stop and steady the motion of his water jugs. They sway like pendulums, their momentum increased every time he steps forward. He slows their swing with his free hand, waits for them to hang motionless before moving forward again. He has to stop twice more before reaching the middle of the bridge. While he waits, he looks to the east and then back in the direction of the brewery. He tries to see if anything looks different from the way it did that morning, other than the still smoking husk of the Yugo. Then it occurs to him that nothing should be different because nothing has changed. Just because he was there this time, closer than normal to the epicenter of the slaughter, doesn't mean it's more relevant to the city. It's just another day. The air raid sirens have stopped. He thinks they've stopped for a while, but he hadn't noticed. A shell falls somewhere far to the west towards the airport. He takes a few steps, lets his load settle, takes a few more. His foot slips a little, which causes the canisters to sway forward, and on their backswing they hit him square in the knee, knocking him to the side. He hits the railing hard, is winded by the force of the blow. He holds on with both hands, puts his foot back on the girder beneath him, but he's shaken. He feels a rage wash over him, the way it does when he hits his head on the corner of the cupboard door or some object he didn't expect to be there, a rage that is focused and scattered all at once. He scrambles to the edge of the bridge without stopping, adrenaline pushing him to it, and drops his water. He lies down on the ground, stomach pressed to the earth, not caring that he's out in the open, an easy target. He cries out, but doesn't recognize the sound that comes out of him. It's a baby and an animal and an air raid siren and a man who's been knocked over by his own burden. He listens to it as it dissipates, gone like it never happened, and then he rolls over onto his back and looks at the sky. He's tired. He's tired from getting water, and he's tired from the world he lives in, a world he never wanted and had no part in creating and wishes didn't exist. He's tired of carrying water for a woman who has never had a kind word to say to him, who acts as if she's doing him a favor, whose bottles don't have handles, and who refuses to switch. If she likes the bottles so much, she should carry them to the brewery. She should watch as the street fills with blood and then washes itself clean, as a man stands with an empty leash and looks for a brown terrier while the dead are loaded into a van. Kenan gets up off the ground. He looks back to the bridge at the spot where he hid Mrs. Rostovsky's water. He turns away and picks up the rope binding his own water bottles. His back bends into its yoke. The water rises into the air. Kenan takes a step and then another. Soon he will be home.